Welcome to this explainer. If you're focused on truly understanding how to build equitable programs and actually dismantle structural barriers, well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the GBA Plus community training course, specifically tailored for the settlement sector. Now, I know what you might be thinking. GBA Plus sounds like some dry, bureaucratic, box-ticking exercise, but I'm going to challenge you to reframe that right now. In this 7-module course, GBA Plus is presented as a radical, empowering, and highly practical framework. It is literally a tool used to tear down invisible structural barriers for newcomers. So, let's dive into this.
Here's the roadmap for our masterclass today. We're covering 1. From bureaucracy to community action. 2. Intersectionality, anti-racism, and equity. 3. Structural barriers and worker burnout. 4. Equitable program design. And 5. Trauma-informed care.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, From Bureaucracy to Community Action.
To really get the origins of this tool, you just have to look at the sheer contrast between these two environments. Over on the left, GBA Plus was initially adopted by the Canadian government way back in 1995 for the UN's Beijing Platform for Action. If you're sitting in a government office in Ottawa, it's a macro-level tool, right? It's basically a legislative requirement for risk mitigation. But shift your focus to the right side. If you're running a frontline NGO or a local settlement agency, you aren't using this to draft a national budget. No way. You are using GBA Plus for sheer survival. You're using it for immediate barrier removal and to achieve actual substantive equity right there on the ground.
Moving right along to Section 2, Intersectionality, Anti-Racism, and Equity. So, to use this framework effectively, we've got to understand what the plus actually stands for. The plus ensures we never ever look at gender in a vacuum. It inextricably links gender to race, class, disability, age, and geography, because the ultimate goal here is substantive equity. Now, this is a massive conceptual hurdle for a lot of people. We're so often taught formal equality. You know, the idea that treating everyone exactly the same is fair. But here's the thing, treating everyone identically completely ignores the wildly different starting points, traumas, and structural disadvantages that marginalized newcomers face. Substantive equity means treating people differentially. We do this to remove their specific, unique barriers so that everyone gets a fair shot at the exact same outcome.
And getting to that substantive equity, well, it means you have to ask some really uncomfortable questions. Like, whose voices are actually defining the community problem? Are we relying on extractive methodologies, basically demanding that marginalized people educate us? Or are we confronting invisible power dynamics and settler colonialism head-on? GBA Plus requires us to bake anti-racism and anti-oppression, often called ARAO, directly into our internal culture. It's a constant audit of who actually benefits from our interventions and who is inadvertently being left out in the cold.
Okay, that brings us to Section 3, Structural Barriers and Worker Burnout.
To see how these concepts build a picture of external crises, we really have to look at the data. Grounding this in physical reality, let's look at Toronto's diverse southwest neighborhoods, places like Parkdale and Mount Dennis. Here, we see structural barriers operating at maximum capacity. Get this, a staggering 44.1% of recent newcomers in this catchment live in unsuitable or overcrowded housing. And when it comes to work, it's just as stark. We are seeing underemployment rates hit 55.7% for internationally educated professionals. Why? Primarily because of systemic credential devaluation and the frankly impossible paradox of employers demanding Canadian experience. When we apply our GBA Plus lens to these demographic facts, it becomes incredibly clear that housing and employment precarity are not felt equally. They heavily intersect with race and gender.
But here's where the framework demands that we turn the lens completely inward. 81%. That is the percentage of the settlement workforce that is female. And not only is this sector heavily feminized, but it is also highly racialized, with huge proportions of staff identifying as Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Black.
And honestly, this leads us to a staggering reality check when it comes to the mental health of this workforce. 75% report poor mental health and massive burnout. The caretakers themselves are incredibly vulnerable. Because this sector relies so heavily on feminized and racialized labor, it ends up being systemically undervalued and underfunded. Think about it. These frontline workers earn modest wages, yet they are navigating the exact same rapid inflation, housing shortages, and food insecurity as the very clients they're serving. We absolutely cannot build resilient communities if the organizations serving them are unintentionally reproducing exploitation internally.
Which naturally leads us to Section 4, Equitable Program and Event Design.
Applying GBA Plus practically can literally transform real-world programs, and even micro-applications of it can save a failing initiative. So imagine this. A rural municipality wants to help newcomer senior women access digital health services. A generic approach would just be to host a digital health workshop. But it flops. Why? Well, an intersectional analysis reveals a tricky mix of digital illiteracy, geographic isolation, and deep cultural taboos around discussing women's health openly. So they go back to the drawing board. They apply GBA+, and they completely redesign it into a seniors tea program. By hosting it offline in a culturally familiar, socially comfortable environment, they remove the threat, they foster connection first, and then subtly integrate the health literacy support. Folks, that is substantive equity in action.
And a lot of times, it all comes down to the absolute logistical details, specifically using the IDA checklist. That's inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Every single logistical choice you make can either build a barrier or remove one. Scheduling an event at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday? Well, you just excluded single mothers and anyone working precarious gig shifts. Choosing a venue requires mapping out transit proximity and ensuring gender-inclusive washrooms are available. And let's talk about compensation for a second. If you are asking a marginalized person to share their lived experience, you absolutely must provide an honorarium. Otherwise, you are just extracting their trauma without fair remuneration. This is exactly how GBA Plus changes the very DNA of event planning.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, Trauma and Violence-Informed Approaches. For our final module, we really have to look at the absolute necessity of trauma-informed care within this framework. Marginalized immigrants frequently carry complex overlapping traumas, from perilous migration and state violence right through to systemic discrimination upon arrival. So GBA Plus has to be tethered to TVIA, Trauma and Violence-Informed Approaches. The core tenet here is universal precautions. Much like in healthcare, we must operate under the assumption that anyone walking through our doors could be carrying trauma. And the most critical takeaway for your organization, service access must never, ever be contingent on forced trauma disclosure. Forcing someone to retell their most painful stories on a basic intake form just to access a service, that can cause severe psychological re-traumatization. We have to build intake processes that allow people to opt out of triggering demographic questions without the fear of losing support.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps most important question. Is your organizational practice unintentionally reproducing systemic exclusion? I really want to leave you with that thought, because GBA Plus isn't just some checklist to help you run better workshops. When it is fully embraced, when we actually confront our internal burnout, when we apply the IDEA framework, and when we center trauma-informed care, it becomes a blueprint for building a society where a newcomer's social location no longer dictates or predicts their capacity to thrive. So take these concepts, ask the hard questions of your own teams, and let's start dismantling those barriers. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.